Pride. Welcome back to Bisexual Killjoy, the place where we know bisexuality isn't a phase, it's a phenomenon. I'm Bailey, and this is
Lynn.
In our last installment, we talked about signaling. In today's episode, Beyond Binaries, Bisexuality and Gender Fluidity, Part 1, we are talking about our favorite topic, liminal spaces. Yay! Because what do sexuality and gender have in common? They're fluid, which is why people have a hard time understanding them. Though I'll wager a guess that bisexuals and other folks on the bi+ spectrum have a better understanding of what gender fluidity is than the biphobes would have you believe. We'll also be discussing what happens to sexuality when it isn't bound by binary correlations. But before we dive into the deep end, Lynn, what was your bisexual killjoy moment this week?
So the Bisexual Killjoy story that I wanted to share, I think is a classic. I was hanging out at an LGBT center, and as we're talking about why we're there, I mentioned that I'm bisexual at some moment in time. And this person goes, "Oh, so you're not into trans people?" And I kind of freeze up and I'm like, I mean, I'm bisexual in that gender doesn't really. I can be attracted to anyone regardless of gender. And then they kind of go, "Oh, so you're pan." And I'm like, well, bisexuality has always meant regardless of gender. And I call myself bisexual. I'm bi, not pan. The person got a little huffy about it. They were not very happy with my explanation. I decided not to take it any further because it was one of my first few times in the center and I didn't want to cause a really big scene. But I think that it was a defining moment for me as a bisexual killjoy in that it was the first time of many that I've had to have that conversation where they've told me what bisexuality means. They've told me that bisexuality is trans-exclusive, or they've told me, hey, that's not the label you should be using. It was also a crucial moment for me to acknowledge and recognize that I am the foremost authority on the label that I choose and how I define it as well.
You know, I've also felt misunderstood identifying as bisexual instead of pansexual. And before I get into it, I want our listeners to know that I think that plurisexual labels under the bi+ umbrella are totally valid. But I've also been in similar situations where I told someone in the queer community specifically that I was bi, and then they tried to come for me because bisexuals are, like you said, trans-exclusive. Like, bestie, no, they aren't. If a trans person and I found one another attractive, I was single, there would be no reason for me not to get involved with them either sexually or romantically. And this is why I really like, and I know many bisexuals like Robin Oakes' personal definition of bisexuality, which we definitely referenced in episode 1. I call myself bisexual because I acknowledge that I have in myself the potential to be attracted romantically and or sexually to people of more than one gender, not necessarily at the same time, not necessarily in the same way, and not necessarily to the same degree. However, as a person who feels most comfortable identifying as a woman, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Lynn, to take the lead on the conversation about bisexuality and its relationship to gender fluidity.
So I'm very, very excited to explore this kind of messy middle of what it means to be bisexual and the relationship that bisexuality has with gender. And when I say bisexual, of course, I include all plurisexual labels under the bi umbrella. Unfortunately, I will say there is very little research done on the topic. At the intersection of bisexuality and gender, what you'll often find are the stories of bisexual women or bisexual men. And it was always a little tricky because my experience with sexuality and gender has felt very different. In my work, I argue that bisexuality in general and bisexual people in particular open a space to think about the intersection of gender and sexuality in a very unique way. Largely because people who are non-binary, trans, or gender fluid are not bound to the same song and dance that monosexuals are. And on a personal level, I don't have a problem calling myself a woman back home or whenever I'm speaking Spanish. Language is a really big part of how we conceptualize ourselves and how we understand the world around us and how we communicate that. However, since moving to the States, it's been a little over 2 years, the more I immerse myself even deeper in LGBT communities here, I've found that people are actually really defensive about their gender. I stumble into conversations where non-binary and trans people will have full explanations for their gender and they have a really strong attachment to it. There's an investment in understanding themselves in a very specific way and getting others to perceive them that that way as well. For me, I don't have that same investment. I was never quite defensive of anything other than, I'm clearly not a guy. My take on the world was that gender lies in the eye of the beholder. And in proper academic fashion, like, I have theorists who are going to back me up on that, Gender's not about me, it's about how people perceive me. But the more I spoke about bisexuality and talked one-on-one with students, the more I realized that this was actually a really common experience for bisexual people. Gender and sexual identity were either completely separate things of like, why do people assume I'm gay just because my hair is so short? Or they were two things that were entirely intertwined, saying things like, I'm bisexual in that I'm fluid in my sexuality and my gender. So in proper academic fashion, I wanted to do the research. I wanted to find the answers. Were bi people more likely to be non-binary? What words were there to describe this feeling of, I don't care how others interpret my gender? Or this very specific feeling that I hate of leave me alone whenever the gender question pops up in a survey. Let me tell you that filling out PhD applications was a nightmare.
Really?
Looking at the drop-down multi-selection thing, all of them are different for different universities. And I'm like, can we just not ask? When doing the research, I came up with little to no answers on it, and it was very disheartening. So, putting the pieces together was up to me.
As a researcher, you're on the other side of it, right? Because the labels are helpful in terms of bucketing data and discovering trends. But on a personal level, it's like, why do you need to know this? I worked in admissions for a long time, and it was such a big deal when they finally put, what do you identify with? And you were allowed to type in what your actual gender identity was. But you're talking about how we have to put the pieces together for ourselves. And man, bisexuals really like to work. I mean, we don't like to work, but we have to work. We're doing all of it on our own. But before we can really even talk about gender, we have to talk about labels, or rather the work that labels do. Even if you don't subscribe to gender, you're gender nonconforming, that's still a label, right? Like, it tells us something about you. We use labels to do all of this work because humans are wired to categorize. We use labels to note our gender and the gender of our partner, and listeners will automatically make assumptions about our relationship dynamics, including our sexuality.
And bisexuality destabilizes this process, because I can tell you that I'm bisexual, and as I'm telling a story about my partner, use they them pronouns, and you don't get to know what kind of fun I'm having in bed.
Well, if you look a certain way, people will make assumptions.
Well, yeah, assumptions are the core of the English language for some reason. And in the past 2 episodes of Bisexual Killjoy, we've spoken about binary correlations between gender and sexuality. Bisexuals exist in a liminal, fluid, messy middle kind of space.
Do you think that's where the chaotic bisexual stereotype comes from?
I think so. I think it comes from the stereotype of bisexuals can't make up their minds, so we've embraced it as a quirk.
It's not a quirk. That's me blowing raspberries. It's not a quirk, it's not a bug, it's a feature.
Yes, it's not a bug, it's a feature. I love that. The crucial thing to remember here, and we're going to delve into that more today, is that the same way that those who are looking at us are forced to interrogate what they truly want to know when they ask the question of our sexuality, we, bisexuals, as those who are actively experiencing bisexuality, like I'm in the thick of it, also must interrogate what this in-between space means for us.
Yeah, bisexuality as a label doesn't denote my gender, the gender of my partner, or, as you just said, the kind of fun I'm having in bed. I say bisexual, and any number of combinations can come to mind for the person listening to me. But mostly, when queer people are trading sexuality labels, I think we're just trying to communicate 3 fundamental things. Am I safe with you is number 1. Can I flirt with you? And is there a chance that you're flirting with me?
Not that being bisexual makes those last 2 any easier. Flirting is hard, and it's hard to know how to flirt. I'm sure so many bisexual people can back me up on this. We don't know what fellow bisexuals look like. We don't know if people are into us, and we have no idea how to tell others we might be into them. I was recently playing We're Not Really Strangers with a fellow friend of me and my partners, and we were talking about stories stories of our relationship. You know, what was the moment that you knew that you were into each other? And I do think that it is very bisexual of me and Anna that we met through a dating app. Like, there's one reason why you meet on dating apps, right? We had...
And you still didn't know?
Oh, it gets worse.
Oh, no.
We had gone on multiple dates. We went on our coffee date. I went back to her place. We've watched movies together. We had talked. And it was the first time I stayed the night. And we're laughing, we're talking, we're in bed, we're kissing. And through all of this time, Bailey, I'm like, but does she really like me, though?
Lynn.
And it wasn't until in the middle of us kissing and she stops and she goes, "Geez Louise."
Not that.
And I'm like, what?
Not the cheese Louise. Okay.
That I kind of go, oh, so that's what's happening. And
no, pause. Had you kissed before this?
yeah.
Lynn, I'm going to be really honest with you. You're really lucky that Anna stayed with you because...
How dare.
I'm on Anna's side because geez Louise is right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very lucky. That is 100% sure. But it was definitely a moment of how do you know that someone is wholeheartedly into you? Because it feels hard to identify, especially as a bisexual person who the lines between platonic and romantic relationships kind of cross. I cuddle with my friends the same way that I cuddle with romantic partners, and we watch movies together. So it gets to a point where it's just kind of like, okay, but is she really into me? And it wasn't until, she gave me this really amazing kiss and she goes, "Geez Louise," of like, "You're amazing." But I'm like, so that's okay.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that bisexuals can't catch a break on dating because monosexism and heterosexism rule the world with an iron fist.
And a secret monosexual cancel. Oh. Don't forget that one.
We won't forget that. I'm listening to you, tell this story, and I realize that at some point we are going to have to talk about love on this podcast and intimacy. And I know the people on Instagram and some of the emails we get, folks want to talk about dating and romantic relationships, but I think it's important to talk about these platonic relationships and the many different faces of love, because for queer people, and I think bisexuals in particular, love is complicated in a really great way.
In an amazing, enriching, beautiful roller coaster kind of way.
Yeah.
I love love so much. And it's a shame that love is so shrouded in heterosexuality and how our interactions are shrouded in that too. And it's not just love and our understanding of it, and it's not just our interactions that are surrounded and contained in heterosexuality. It's also our self-understanding. I can't speak for all bisexuals, or can I? But
today you can.
Today I can. But the way that I experience attraction is fluid. There are times in my life where you can't pay me to go on a date with a guy. You can't. And on those days, I'm gonna stick to my button-down shirts. I'm in my flannels, my Doc Martens, wherever I go. I am not putting on makeup, no matter. And then there are days when I feel especially feminine, and I do expect extra attention from guys on those days. And if I do get that extra attention, I might consider a formal date if they dare to ask. The way that I perform gender depends a lot on how I'm trying to get others to perceive me and read me and what kind of attention I'm expecting to get that day. The stories I hear from most bisexual people who are questioning their sexuality often revolve around gender too. They'll say things along the lines of, "I just feel more masculine when I'm with women." Bisexual people spend a lot of time at the edges of gender expression and are largely influenced by outside factors that often have nothing to do with how strongly they feel about their own gender identity. The performance depends on things like acceptance, environment, safety, outness.
Let's talk about performance. In researching for this podcast, I know we both struggled to find sources that encapsulated our feelings, sort of backed up what we've been thinking and talking about. But I did find this qualitative study, "We Can Shapeshift and Build Bridges: Bisexual Women and Gender Diverse People of Color on Invisibility and Embracing the Borderlands," which is from 2019. And it looks at the impact that invisibility has on bisexuals and the gender diverse. And if you want to read it yourself, the link is in the show notes. But here's a quote that I think gets at the heart of this article. Bisexual people are in the unique position of having the perception of their sexual orientation largely determined by the gender of their romantic or sexual partner. When dating an other gender, cisgender presenting person, they are seen as heterosexual. And when dating a same gender or visibly gender minority person, they are assumed to be queer. This erasure is multiplied for bisexual, transgender, and gender diverse people. Research on bisexual, transgender people suggests that they feel their bisexual identity is structurally disallowed and that they encounter others who believe that they cannot be transgender and bisexual at once. Similar to bisexual people, gender diverse people challenge assumptions of gender and sexuality, experience high rates of discrimination and poor mental health, and often feel excluded from transgender communities.
As I'm reflecting on that quote, I think the part that caught me the most was the structurally disallowed. Mm-hmm. And we spoke about the epistemic erasure in our erasure episode earlier on, as bisexuality is erased from collective knowledge, where we're not allowed to know, recognize, or acknowledge ourselves to be in a liminal fluid space. And that includes bisexuality.
What really blows me away from the findings of this article is the fact that transgender and gender diverse people don't feel allowed to interact in, my takeaway was like queer spaces, despite the fact that they are obviously queer. I think that people who challenge gender binaries themselves are inherently queer, perhaps the most queer, because what are they doing except queering their experience of being a person? I think that's pretty cold, hard evidence for the fact that they belong in a room that is for queer people, right?
I think that here it's important to acknowledge a separation, or maybe not a separation, a distinction between what it means to be in an LG space and the purpose of an LG space and the purpose of a queer space. And I think that what makes it hard for gender diverse people, bisexual people, people who challenge the norms in these really radical ways, to identify which spaces are LG and which spaces are meant to stir shit up. It has a lot to do with they're all called the same thing. They're all called LGBT centers. They're all called LGBT gatherings or meetups. And it's not until you get there that you all of a sudden are faced with like, oh, there's only cis people here. There's only cis monosexual people here. And it's complicated.
Whereas in spaces that are designed for bi+ people, I've noticed that they tend to be way more gender diverse and accepting. And I've met more trans women and trans men in those spaces than I ever did in LGBT plus like general spaces, which have, in my experience, been very cisgender and very white. Anyway, but I do just want to say I'm bumping up against my actual issue with the larger queer community. And this is why our producer thinks that people are going to come for us, is the fact that bisexuals are told that they are trans exclusive, when I would argue that the bi+ community is the most gender diverse and radically gender diverse, because we challenge all of these things all of the time, not just with our sexuality, but with who we are as people. So how dare you? How dare you try to tell us how to police our community when we're the ones who are welcoming all of the people who don't fit into the neat boxes of LG communities?
Yes. Like, historically, the B's and the T's have always been together. And we were together when we were medicalized and fetishized, and we're together now as we're actively excluded from monosexual spaces.
That's my sibling right there.
Yes. I'm trying not to get pissed off.
I took my medicine today for this.
I'm pissed. And I don't know if I'm pissed at an abstract idea of this is something that I experienced a few times and no longer do. But then again, I don't really leave my apartment. All I do is read and write.
Wow.
So...
Okay. Well, you have the summer off, so you can, like, interact more with your community.
And I will read and write and crochet.
Okay. You can body double with somebody and then, like, build community. But to look at this article, because I think this article is really important. And if listeners have the time, you should read it, because it's not a concept that I'm mad with. There are ramifications for the exclusion of the gender diverse and trans communities because they feel erased. They are more likely to have poorer mental health outcomes than people who feel included, the people who have community. And even though this article also talks about the resiliency that the individuals who were interviewed for this article have, they feel like, oh, I'm my own person. I feel like really comfortable in my skin. That's a coping mechanism, right? That's something you have to do if you're going to survive and find a way to be happy. But just because they can doesn't mean they should. And by telling me as a bisexual person that I am trans exclusive, that I and my community are trans exclusive, is just not right. That's just not factually true whatsoever. And now I'm getting mad. It's important that we not just talk about this in theory. This is something that is impacting human lives. And if you are a person who's listening to this and thinking the bi+ community is trans exclusive, you really need to interact with a bi+ space and meet bi+ people, because you will learn very quickly that you are wrong.
Yeah. And I think that the common, I want to say, understandings of what bisexuality is or how bisexual people are comes from spaces that are not bi+ specific. What you learn about bisexual people, you'll hear more accurately, you'll overhear in LG spaces or heterosexual spaces or from a monosexual friend. I explore this a lot in my work. Bi+ spaces are a kind of utopia. We experience the world differently. We have a bi+ worldview that can only be manifested when we surround ourselves with other bi+ folks.
Yep.
So you don't know what it is to be surrounded or to interact with bi+ folks until you've gone to a bi+ specific space event.
But they're less likely to exist because we're chronically underfunded and overworked, right?
Right. Okay. Wait. I know the solution for this.
Please, let me write it down.
Bailey, we're starting a nonprofit.
Lynn, we have so much we're doing. We have so much we're doing. We can't take on more work. This is the responsibility of larger LGBT plus communities that say they are inclusive. Where's your support for bi+ people? Where are your bi+ specific support groups? Where's the money for the people that are running them? I know that everyone is running on skeleton crews and none of us have any cash, but you are letting down a huge portion of your queer population, most of your queer population, by not funding bi+ projects, communities, speakers, whatever it is. So not right now, Lynn.
And I think that the article itself tackles lots of additional very important topics as they surround bi+ people. I think that what struck me most about it was how gender is racialized and the experiences of biracial people, how they include a level of gender racialization. Depending on where you're located, woman means different things, as with any gender label. I mentioned earlier that whenever I'm speaking Spanish or whenever I'm back home, I have no problem saying I'm a woman. And it's because it's contextual. Spanish is an incredibly gendered language. And the way that women are viewed in PR is radically different from the way that they're viewed in the States. And I think that what struck me most is, hey, you know, I've been in the States for a few months and I haven't referred to myself in a way that is gendered once. That was a very strange experience for me. And so it depends on how others are viewing you. It depends on the kind of people that you're surrounded by. And it depends on how your worldview is shaped or influenced by the way that you communicate that understanding. And as we were doing the research, I came across this Rosie Nelson book that I had been hunting down for like forever, by the way. And I finally got my hands on it thanks to my library. Shout out to libraries, they're amazing. And they talk about gender ambivalence. And gender ambivalence as the moment when bi+ people reach a point where they have no stake in what gender means, and yet necessarily act out roles relating to the gender binary and to cis-normativity for the purpose of safety.
You know, I'm sitting here hearing you talk about this, reflecting on my own experiences with gender. How does one begin to enter the process of gender ambivalence?
Well, in my research, what I found is that for those folks whose sexual identity came first, they understood themselves as bi+ first, there's a murky area in the process of queer coding, in the process of letting others know that they are bi+. Gender feels fake, and it reveals itself as a product of the patriarchy. A research participant of mine mentioned putting on nail polish as a way to queer code to others around him, and then it just became a slippery slope into other things, viewing clothing as non-gendered, playing around with gender roles in their relationships. Their gender just seems to expand and stretch to include all of these new manifestations. That is, until they're questioned on it, and they get asked the question of, but if you do that, then are you really this? And that's when they realize that they held no real attachment to their gender in the first place.
While you were talking about that, I was thinking about how skirts on men have really come into fashion, especially on the runway. And I think that's really interesting that we're challenging what does it mean to wear gendered clothes and why are clothes gendered? Going back to the history of clothing, like we did in the signaling episode, you know, for a long time, men wore high heels. They were for writing. And if a woman wore high heels, that was seen as very masculine. And now if a man wears high heels, it's seen as feminine. So gender itself is a very spectrum thing and something that I have had to think about a lot as we've done this podcast together. Not because I identify as a cisgendered woman, but when I was coming up, my parents were divorced, but I saw my dad every weekend. It was like a very strong co-parenting relationship. And when I was with my mother, single mom, kick-ass lady, could do everything. In a lot of ways, she raised me without gender. There was nothing that I couldn't do or wear or say. It was the expectation that I had to be self-sufficient. And in self-sufficiency, there is no gender because who's going to fix your car? There's no man around, so you got to fix your car.
Preach.
You have to pick up sticks. You have to mow the lawn. You have to power wash the house. You have to kill the bug. And on the flip side, my mother was also, or is, an incredible cook, an incredible baker. And that in itself is gendered work, but not the restaurant business where she was because there's mostly men in the kitchen. On that one side, I was, this child who wore a lot of jeans and t-shirts and grandpa sweaters. And then when I went to my dad's house, it was like this cognitive dissonance because my father kind of raised me the same way, this expectation that I had to do everything and be self-sufficient. But when he married my stepmom, she's definitely more girly. And she was the one who's like, oh, Bailey, you need to learn how to shave your legs. And oh, you need to learn how to wear this and how to put together clothing. And this is how you are attractive to men. And it was really hard for me because she's telling me that, but also my dad signed me up for flag football. So like, what am I supposed to be? What is gender? And as I've gotten older, I am still this really self-sufficient person. I enjoy a good dress because I like the drape, not because I'm like, this is what women wear, but I don't feel a call to use they, them pronouns. I use she, her pronouns, and I probably always will. And I like makeup because I enjoy the way it makes my face look, not because I feel like I'm performing gender. I like what makeup does. It can change you into a different person. It can help you shapeshift, right?
Yeah.
So I have a complex relationship with gender, but at the same time, it's very simple. I identify as a gender, but at the same time, I feel like I have no gender. Does that make sense?
It does. It really does. And I'm making an effort to build a Zotero library on what in the world is gender even. Like, what is it? I don't know. And my experience with gender is similar in a way, the same way that gender lies in the eye of the beholder. And I hold on to that so tightly. Upon realizing a few times that like, hey, I haven't referred to myself in a gendered way in a while. I wonder what happens if I allow people to choose for me. And as I started exploring using any all pronouns, it became a really quirky thing of, hi, I'm Lynn, pronouns any, all, or none at all. And very consistently, people would use she, her pronouns. Largely, I think, because I have long hair. And I don't think I'll ever cut my hair really short because I don't like how my face looks.
Oh, Lynn.
With my hair short, I don't. So if 5 years from now I hear this again and I have short hair, we'll talk about it then.
Okay.
It was very consistent, just she, her pronouns, and that was not a problem until all of a sudden people started using they, them pronouns. And I was like, wait, what's happening? I was like, oh, they're talking about me. Right. Oh, okay. And I was once in this faculty meetup situation, and one of the faculty was explaining to another student, what any all pronouns meant. And as she was explaining, she says, oh, it means that you can use any pronouns, she, they, or even he. And the way that she said it was like so like shocked. And I was like, I don't understand why that's a shock factor. Specifically because that day I was wearing my button down shirts and my flannel and just living life.
I want you to know that I roulette your pronouns. Every time I refer to you to something different.
I love that. Oh my God, yes. Yes.
So it shouldn't be a shock to anybody. If those are the pronouns, you're like any and all, you shouldn't default to she, her because someone looks like what you expect a woman to look like. But go on.
Yeah, but going back to the language bit, English is a language that is riddled with assumptions. And that has a lot to do with our binary understandings of not just gender and sexuality, but our binary understandings of the world and how everything has an opposite. And if you're not saying one, then you're automatically saying the other, quote unquote. So it gets complex in that way, and that people don't understand how to take in something that says to be one thing but appears to be another.
So, joke's on the biphobes. Guess what? Bisexuality isn't actually trans or non-binary exclusive at all. We are for everybody. And much like for everybody, we have homework for all of you listeners. For our allies, and this is everyone really, I think it's important to question your gender and sexuality. If you're not asking yourself questions, do you even know who you are? But it's important because we have all these big graduation speeches going on right now. Lynn and I are recording this in May, and it's graduation season here in Boston, which I hate because there's so many parents in town who don't know where they're going and they drive really poorly. But you've got these graduation commencement speeches that are telling young women that their greatest joy in life is to be a wife and mother. And we should all be examining and challenging gender roles. Like, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be non-binary? What does that really fucking mean? What does society want us to think it means? And if there was ever a month when you were going to respect people's pronouns or be curious about gender, June is it.
Amen. And for our bisexual killjoys, we've emphasized the importance of joy for you throughout all of our episodes, and that's important. But today, I want to challenge you and your community involvement. I dare you to find one bisexual group you haven't engaged with yet and go to one of their events. Sign up for a meetup, workshop, social, pride event. We plurisexual people are likely to feel isolated and alone, especially as we wrestle with complicated feelings surrounding our gender and sexuality. That's why bi+ specific spaces are so important. But those spaces are nothing if you're not there to remind the organizers why they need to happen. So go, have an experience, make friends, and make sure you write to us. Tell us how it went.
And for the LGBT groups, the ones that are supposed to be, putting on these events, the proof is in the data. There are so many gender diverse bisexuals, and I imagine in other sexual orientations, that do not feel comfortable in your queer spaces. Those are spaces that you have created. How can you improve them? Things that came to mind when I was writing this was create a coalition that aims to understand your community and make sure that the people on that coalition are gender diverse, they're racially diverse. It shouldn't just be, sexuality is not a monolith, and therefore your coalition shouldn't be either. You need to have gender diverse members on your boards. You need to get the word out about the services you offer, and that can be really hard because you need to identify community partners who are willing to help you, but also are willing to trust you, and that takes time. And unfortunately, it takes money. How are you getting your funding to these communities? They need to be a priority, and I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the more funding you put into the underrepresented, the healthier your community becomes. And it sort of creates this really cool feedback loop. Now, Lynn is going to attempt to summarize whatever the fuck we just talked about. Go, Lynn.
Honestly, it has been a journey in exploring this messy middle. I don't know if we got anywhere. I think that in proper bisexual fashion, this episode exists as a part one of multiple in a liminal, fluid, multifaceted space that aims to explore the limits and the edges of gender expression. And what does it mean to actively be thinking about what gender is? And I am so excited to continue exploring the naming of this feeling of leave me the fuck alone. whenever the gender question pops up. So if this episode is rated E, that is my fault this time.
I think we both had our drops today. As we wrap up, though, we've actually been hearing from you all in our email, and it really moves both of us to hear how much the podcast matters to you or what it's made you think about. I've had longtime friends tell me that the podcast makes them think about the way they present their bisexuality to the world, and it's not just something that they, oh, I'm bisexual. No one else needs to know. So I would like to read a little bit of one of my favorite pieces of fan mail that we've gotten. It says, "Hi, Bailey and Lynn. I was listening to your second episode, which was about bi healthcare, and just about burst into tears in the parking lot of my son's school. The confusion and messiness of a bisexual brain and not knowing where and how to find each other is so real. I don't know what it is about the two of you that is compelling me to fling my emotional, tangled little brain and heart at you. I hope that's okay if I tell you my journey. I'm 41, which is weird because I feel like a goofy 12-year-old about half the time and an imposter adult the rest of the time, white, femme, female. And before about half a year ago, I didn't pay much attention to my sexuality or the idea of my self-expression. I've only ever been in 2 long-term relationships, both with lovely, kind, cis-het white men. And at some point when I was younger, it was kind of a joke. I only dated the gayest of non-gay men, which is what? Is that a bi wife? Which was meant as a compliment because at the time, the phrase toxic masculinity wasn't really a thing. It's funny to me now that the only way we had to define good masculinity was apparently to say gay, both solid as a giant compliment. Anyway, I digress. For years now, I would describe myself as on the rainbow spectrum if it organically came up. Both men, the second I'm still married to, still attractive, best person I know, knew I had fantasies about women or knew that I thought as a general rule that girls were way better kissers. True. Knew that I'd had encounters, but never anything serious. All in all, it was never a thing I labeled. I thought all girls thought this way. I thought it was normal to me because it was normal. I couldn't and still can't even conceive of the possibility that a woman wouldn't ever look at another girl and think, oh yeah, I would totally make out with her. I still can't understand why anyone wouldn't think that. Like, never? Really? How though? Anyway, I'm still convinced that more people do and they just haven't labeled it or paid attention either. Then a year ago, I fell hard for a woman, really hard, profoundly, stupidly hard, almost destroyed my beautiful marriage hard. And it wasn't because I wasn't attracted to my husband. I very much was, still am. We're still together and better than ever thanks to therapy. More people should go to therapy. It was also more of like, oh my God, also this, where have you been my whole life? And then my brain on that one was just like, oh my God, no words left. Just dumb sounds coming out of my face. It was like another puzzle piece snapped together. I texted a couple of my friends and husband about super smart, fascinating hot girl and said, I have such a crush on her. I didn't come out to them. That's not what it felt like. It was so easy and matter of fact, like I'd just seen an amazing sunset. Casual. And that's when I started actually paying attention. I'd gone to Pride, but always as a quasi-ally. I have queer friends, but never even thought of myself being in that community. I've always liked blending masculine and feminine things and being cheekily subversive, like little subtle rebellions all the damn time. I'm the one who orders the steak and drives the old super masculine beat-up 4Runner. My husband gets a salad in the nice little sedan. People describe me as having masculine energy, despite the fact that I'm more often than not a goofball sporting bright lipstick. It's like suddenly I can see color I couldn't see before, and it's iridescent and glorious. Like I'm this little zippy bedazzled hummingbird that can spot all of these beautiful glowy UV bits. Oh yeah, I don't sit in chairs right. I also love lemon bars, finger guns, and puns. That's weirdly accurate. Have I had blue or purple or pink hair at some point? Yeah. Am I bipolar? Type 2, not so much the manic way, just more depression. But stereotypes aside, and I'm fully in the court of we don't really have stereotypes because we are all the things, because inclusive is everything we are all about. So much sense because looking back. But trying to figure out what's me versus what's the bi part outside of attraction is impossible to separate. And maybe that's why it's so hard to define what being bi is. Because it's subtle. Because it's always morphing. Because you can fit in and be normal. Because erasure is there before you even know what to look for. What I loved about what you said and what stopped me in my tracks was the bit about the journey and how it evolves and keeps evolving and how just having someone say, yep, been there, that hit hard. Even though I know that these things are so fluid. Even though I've had some of those conversations with close friends and I needed to hear that. I'm lucky in that I have a couple of dear friends who are both bi, whom I can confide in and ask questions. And this brings me to my final point. The loneliness, despite having people I can talk to, suddenly feels so much larger. On so many pages on Instagram, bi relationships show girl, and that's celebrated and good. It should be. But so often I read things like, ugh, I was with a man, and what was I even thinking? And I can't even believe I'm still attracted to men. Like, bi-ness is only valid if you're in an obviously queer relationship, despite so many of the same people saying every feeling, every relationship is valid. There's an undercurrent there that separates me, pushes my relationship aside. It's like I'm not brave enough if I'm in a hetero relationship. I hate it when men complain about their wives to other men. That whole ball and chain thing. That feels a lot like that. Now, if I was single and wanted to date, what would I choose? A woman, for sure. But I can't ever imagine a world where I would not celebrate the awesomeness that is my dude, my kind, accepting, hilarious, beautiful man who celebrates me. Bi wife energy off the charts. And yet I've been so untethered and deeply lonely, and I didn't realize it until you named it. You two made me feel okay. You two made me feel like I was still home within the bi community, still valid. And now I'm crying my face off. I embraced what I am. It felt so good to have a label that resonated, and it was so empowering. I cried happy tears every time I've told someone. I read the books, I talked to friends, I looked for allies, I was excited, and then I went online to look for people, and my balloon was so deflated, and I couldn't find a whole lot of me. You two helped some of my buoyancy come back. I feel lighter. I feel cared for, even though you two are complete strangers. I feel seen with the mental health stuff in a way I hadn't before. So thank you. From the bottom of my sprightly heart, I didn't mean to write you a whole book, but I think just now, with your voices in my head, I'm in the next step of embracing myself and ready to be a killjoy because, yes, damn it, I'm still bi, even though I'm married to a guy. Maybe if I say it to enough people, other people will tell me in return, and maybe my non-straight family will grow, and I have you two to thank. I was so moved by this, and I know you were too. This actually did bring me to tears. So thank you to this listener for pouring their soul out to us. If you ever need a place to rant about bisexuality, our email is a great place to do it. We talk about it. We send each other little emojis when like, did you get the email in the inbox? Oh my God, it's amazing. So thank you for tuning in to Bisexual Killjoy, where we do know that bisexuality is not a phase. It's a phenomenon. We are finishing up the season. Releases will be throughout the rest of June. And to support our work, you can follow us on Instagram. You can subscribe to our Substack. You can rate our podcast, preferably 5 stars. And we do want to hear from you. So you can share your stories on Instagram or via email at bisexualkilljoy@gmail.com. And until then, keep being a bisexual killjoy.
Stay bisexual and stay strong.